Surely, goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Sounds like a theme, doesn't it? Welcome to our third sermon in the Hot Summer of Psalms series. Hopefully, the sermons have been warm and helpful. Even if the weather has been a bit too hot, we might get some relief soon. So far, we've explored God's everlasting reign in Psalm 145 and the rise from lament in Psalms 13 and 130. Today, we'll dive into Psalm 23, a familiar and beloved psalm. This psalm of trust, often associated with funerals, is a source of comfort and assurance. But it's more than just a funeral psalm. It speaks to us in our daily lives, offering God's guidance, provision, and restoration. Let's explore how Psalm 23 shows us that God is not just a distant deity, but our shepherd, walking with us through life, providing for us, and restoring our souls.
Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Sounds like a theme. We heard the choir sing it, and then we read it together. And Paul gave one of the reasons why, because God pursued us with goodness and mercy through the Good Shepherd, Jesus. Well, here we are on our third sermon in our Hot Summer of Psalms series. Hopefully, the sermons have been reasonably hot, or at least warm and helpful. And today we turn to Psalm 23, the 23rd Psalm. A very familiar psalm, very near and dear to many of us. And I've called the sermon All We Want. Remember that Israel had a songbook, and that songbook is what we call the book of Psalms, and it contains praises and hymns, both community and individual, and lament, and psalms of trust, like we look at today. We've looked at a hymn of praise in Psalm 145. I mentioned the two laments last week, and today, a hymn of trust. If you are following along in your bulletin with the note-taking prompt, you see the first one is the funeral psalm. I'll go ahead and ask for audience participation today. How many of you have been to a funeral that the 23rd Psalm was read? Or frequently, even if it's not read, it's in the program there, because it is a familiar psalm of comfort and is very often used. Carolyn's husband's Lynn's funeral, when I got there, a former pastor of theirs was the main officiant, but he asked me to read the 23rd Psalm and to say a few words on it. So we often identify the 23rd Psalm with funerals, and I think that's with good reason. It professes and proclaims God's faithfulness to our departed loved one. God has been faithful through this life that we're celebrating, and in fact, in many cases, of course, the promise of verse 6, dwelling in the house of the Lord forever, while we're seeing a glimpse of that in this life, our loved one has realized it. And so the psalm fits. But it's also a psalm of comfort for us as we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the dark valley of mourning with them. But if we limit Psalm 23 just to being the funeral psalm, we would miss it as a vital resource that speaks to us in the ordinary, more normal circumstances of daily living. And that's what I want to explore more with us today. Like many Psalms, it began as an individual testimony of what one pilgrim walking with God through life had experienced through their whole life. The psalmist isn't trying to defend their faith. They're just singing about it, praising their God and God's faithfulness to them. They're not demanding a response. They're simply testifying to God's goodness that they've experienced in good times and bad. As I've already mentioned, this is a psalm of trust. Psalms of trust aren't a whole lot different than psalms of request or lament. But the difference, the distinction, is where does the emphasis fall? In laments, we very much dwell in the problem. The psalmist is crying out to God, "How long?" or "Have mercy, Lord." While the emphasis in the psalm of trust, like the 23rd Psalm, is on the trust, on the rejoicing, on the confidence that God will and is with the psalmist and with us. And today we see Psalm 23 speaking powerfully to and for God's people throughout our faith walks in good times and bad. So I want to look at the beginning of this trust psalm where the psalmist looks at God's caring, provision, abundance, and restoration throughout the psalm. In fact, the psalmist sets it up in the first 3 verses, has a bit of a transition in verse 4, and then reiterates God's caring, provision, abundance, and restoration, and reinforces it in verses 5 and 6. Take a look at the first verse. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." That's the introduction. The psalmist is saying God isn't some distant deity out in space somewhere or even in heaven somewhere. God is our shepherd, walking through life, leading us through life, guiding us through life, providing for us with care in life, right with us. And then the psalmist continues, "He makes me lie down in green pastures." We talk about obeying God and how obedience matters. I'm always stricken when I read this. It doesn't say He allows me to lie down or He makes available green pastures for me to lie down. No, He makes me lie down in green pastures. God says there's time to rest. Life wears us out. I know there are some of you in here that right now say, "Life wears me out." God provides green pastures. God leads us to the green pastures and makes us lie there. God's caring provision. But the green pastures, I like Eugene Peterson's translation in the Message, lush meadows, and then still waters. Now, still waters may not be that big of a deal for us. We've been having plenty of rain the last few days. So lush meadows and still waters, that was abundant life for the psalmist. So God cares as a shepherd. God leads to abundant living. And then God is a shepherd who restores our life. The shepherd cares and restores our total being. The word that we translate soul doesn't talk about some spiritual thing that's disembodied from our body and goes off to heaven someday. No, the Hebrew word translated soul means our very being, our emotions, our hearts, our passion, our inner self. In fact, a few modern translations translate, He restores my life, which gets it closer, but even that's not fully captures the full meaning. In fact, when I've learned Psalms and looked at Hebrew in my seminary classes and in some commentaries, there are a number of words that scholars don't even translate because they are so hard to express in English. One is that favorite word of mine. Maybe you've remembered it, hesed, which is in Psalm 23, by the way. We'll get to it in a little while. The other one is this word for soul. It's nephesh, is the word. So now you have two Hebrew words, hesed and nephesh. But frequently they won't even be translated because, again, you can't capture what they mean in English. So the shepherd restores our total being, all of us. And this restoration is for a purpose. Yes, the shepherd cares for us, the shepherd provides for us, the shepherd gives us abundance, but the shepherd also has a plan for this restoration so that we can enter into an appropriate relationship with God, the one who restores. Restores us what? For paths of righteousness, the right paths, to walk with God, our shepherd, in a right relationship, fulfilling what God wants. And then we get to the fourth verse. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort. This is the transition, the pivot verse. But for now, just suffice it to say, in the first three verses, the psalmist is talking about God in the third person, talking about God. But notice, you are with the second person. Now the psalmist is claiming the shepherd as their own, entering into a personal relationship, not talking about God, but recounting their personal experience with God. But you know what changes everything? For you are with me. God's presence changes things. The word, that phrase is actually two words in Hebrew. The word for you is the exact middle of the psalm. There are 28 words before. For you is the 29th word, and there are 28 words that follow in the Hebrew. And it's for you with me. That's the phrase at the very center of the psalm. You are my shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd. Again, third person. And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The bookends of the psalm with God's presence with us right in the center. So everything hinges on that pivot there. But I think, too, it may be the symbol of the Lord is my shepherd, past. You are with me, center of my life, and forever being present. So God is with us, what? Past, present, and future, in the very center of our life as our shepherd. Which brings us to our progressive faith. We've moved from language of creed, from talking about God, to claiming God's presence in very specific material ways. For you are with me, and it starts actually the end of verse 4, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Tangible symbols of the shepherd's care. The rod that helps to guide the sheep, the staff that helps protect the sheep. And then continuing into the end, only goodness and steadfast love shall pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for many years. You read the normal, similar translation that we grew up with and that we know, but a more precise translation of verse 6 changes two things in very critical ways. First of all, goodness and mercy is goodness and chesed, God's faithful love, God's grace, God's present. And remember, that word chesed is God's covenant, God's promise to be our God, my God, the God of God's people. Not that distant deity, but that shepherd that has a claim on our life. And his love will follow. But also the word translated as follow, I'll be honest, I'm not the greatest Hebrew scholar, though sometimes I play one on Sunday mornings. But the Hebrew word that is in our current, latest, best Hebrew text really means pursue, chase. So we're not walking through life with God's love and care following us. It's chasing us, pursuing us. What better image than Jesus? God's care, God's love pursuing us. We as human beings could never live up to God's standards, nor could we even faithfully follow God. So God had to do what? Had to come down in human form, chasing us, pursuing us with his care, with his love. Jesus, our good shepherd. And God is still with us, pursuing us, chasing. In the past, right now, and in the future. Jesus, Emmanuel, God with. Jesus saying, as Paul read, I am the good shepherd. And unlike the hired hand, unlike the robbers and the thieves that were talked about earlier in chapter 10 of John, unlike those, let's call them pretenders or phonies, Jesus, the good shepherd, lays down his life for his. Jesus, the shepherd, God's care, provision, abundant, and restoration personified. Because of this transition from talking about God to testifying to God's presence in our life, makes our faith real, turns it from Sunday school faith or faith of our parents to personal faith. Our own faith. And notice where the transition took place. In the valley of the shadow of death. In our worst times, when we know God is with us, faith becomes real. Faith becomes personal. The Lord is my shepherd. Jesus is my good shepherd. Not mama's, not daddy's, not some preachers, not some Sunday school teachers, not even my friends, but ours, mine, yours, ours together. Our personal Savior. God's promise to the psalmist was simple: I am with. Let's dwell for just a quick moment on this idea of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. The story of Jesus, the Good Shepherd in the New Testament really extends over 2 chapters. It's John 9 and 10. We won't read it here. 9 is pretty long in and of itself, and then 10 is relatively long too. We heard part of the Good Shepherd story out of 10, but perhaps you want to read it on your own when you go home or sometime this week. Well, the sign in John 9 is Jesus healing the man blind from birth, restoring his sight. Now, because of his blindness, he's not allowed in the temple, so he's an outsider. Well, Jesus restores his sight and restores his total life, so now he can become part of the temple. He comes in the temple. People recognize him, especially the leaders recognize him, said, "What are you doing here? Who did this to you?" He says, "I don't know. I heard him say, 'Get up, and your sight is restored.' And I got up and, well, what did he look like? I don't know. I didn't see him. Remember, I was blind." Well, they say, "You're not cooperating. Get out." Jesus, God's goodness and steadfast love does what? Goes and hunts down, pursues, chases the man, and restores him to Jesus' community. You are now part of my sheepfold, my flock. You belong to me. So see what has happened? Jesus, the Good Shepherd, restores him to the synagogue community, the community he's been kicked out of his whole life, God's family, and then he's kicked out again, and Jesus pursues him and restores him. So back to what I said earlier, Jesus is acting out God as our shepherd, providing abundance and restoring, pursuing us with God's goodness and God's mercy. And so we get to the title of the psalm, and we're about to land this ship. And I'll recount the story I've told a couple of times recently that Karen reminded me of the girl in Sunday school who came home proud she'd memorized the 23rd Psalm. And when her parents and audience were listening, she says, "The Lord is my shepherd. That's all I want." The end. With God as our shepherd, we have all we want. Real contentment is wanting what we have that's provided by God, even though we may not have everything that we want. We started with the funeral psalm. We've seen how God is with us through our whole life. And now we get to the political psalm. There's powerful imagery in here, and this could be at least another sermon, perhaps another couple, and I promise you, you're not going to get a second sermon. We'll just summarize why I call this the political psalm. Again, in your mind's eye, transport yourself back 4,000 years, 3,000 years, even 2,000 years, to the time when the psalm and Jesus' teachings were taking place. In the Old Testament and in the Near East during that time, shepherds were symbols for kings, for earthly leaders. In fact, if you look in the prophets, particularly Jeremiah and Ezekiel, Jeremiah, I believe, is Jeremiah 23. The prophets condemned Israel's selfish, faithless, godless kings as unworthy shepherds and professed God's judgment on them. So when God is saying, I am your shepherd, it's back to what we saw 2 weeks ago, God's always and forever reign. God is saying, don't trust earthly leaders. They only lead you astray. I am your real king. Well, that's nice and pretty handy and comfortable for God's people when they listen in the abstract, Psalm 23 style. But then comes Jesus that says, I am the good shepherd, and talks about the thieves that come to kill and destroy, talks about the hired hands. Psalm 23, and Jesus as personifying God's care in Psalm 23, is saying God yields ultimate. Earthly kings, earthly presidents, earthly governors, earthly congresspeople, public officials, public figures, actors, sports stars, rich people aren't those with the power. God has. And God is the one to whom we should look, and God alone. So where do we fit? What's our part? Our part is to share good news, isn't it? We've all been let down by earthly leaders of all sorts. Pastors, religious leaders, teachers, presidents, you name. But God, our shepherd, God, our king, God, our leader, is with us always and will never leave us, never forsake us. Jesus said what? At the end of Matthew's gospel, closing it out, final words, I am with you. Oh, that's the good news. God won't let you down. God won't let me down. God won't let others down. We live in a nation of unfaithful, untrustworthy, partisan, power-seeking leaders, but God is our ultimate leader. And that's what Jesus proclaimed when Jesus proclaimed the kingdom of God. When Jesus said, I am the good shepherd, that's what Jesus was proclaiming. And that subversive message got Jesus killed. Because the earthly powers didn't like being a puppet. But we know the rest of the story, don't we? On the third day, Jesus arose, and Jesus is seated with God, our shepherd, God with us then, now, and forever. Let's dwell in God's house forever.